Welcome back, guys. Let's talk about a few vocab words related to race. Like always, create a new section. Now, race is a tough thing to define, and you'll see that all throughout this period. It's not an excellent way to sort human beings because it's pretty tough to define the boundaries between different races. But put simply, race is an identity with a group, usually based on physical appearance. Usually you can see someone's race, but that is not always the case by far. And family lineage also plays a role. And race is what's known as a social construct. And a social construct is an idea that's been created by people to help us understand the world. And they can be based on science and reality, but they're not always. So if you take the term social, meaning people, and construct as in built it, then a social construct is something that people built. And race is something people built. It wasn't always around. When you look at civilization, we don't talk about race until very recently. Now, this is what's known as an Ngram viewer. It's brought to us by Google, and basically what it does is it searches all of the books they've uploaded in the past few hundred years, and it finds how often certain terms come up. And so this is an Ngram viewer looking at race. Now, race is a tough word to look up in an Ngram viewer because it means more than one thing. You could talk about race as in black, white, Asian, but you could also talk about race as in horse races, car races, track and field races. So not every time you see race will it be talking about people. But we see really before the late 1700s that they don't talk about race that often. You have a decent amount here, which I'd be interested in finding out more about, but you don't really talk about race as a classification system until you get about here. And that's because that's when whiteness was really created. So prior to American slavery of Africans, very few people, if any, identified as white. They were English or French or Irish or German or Polish, but they weren't white. They saw each other as more different than the same. Whiteness was created as an opposition to blackness. Basically, were you eligible to be enslaved or were you free from slavery? That's where whiteness came, and it didn't exist in the thousands of years of human and society history before then. So 1790 American laws are some of the first times people were actually referred to as white. So when we go back here and we see the late 1700s, the explosion of talk about race really makes sense. Today, some people complain that we talk about race way too much, but you see in the Ngram viewer, we're not talking about race more than we were in the past. We see the peak of it is right after the Civil War and Reconstruction. And it really makes sense when you think about our country's racial history, where now all of a sudden black people are free and they're able to do a lot more things. So society had to figure out what is their place. Are they side by side? Are they completely equal? Is there a different system for them? And that's where you see a lot of discussion of race. So the big takeaway from this Ngram viewer is that race is really recent. It's about as old as our country, and our country is one of the youngest ones in the world. Speaking of our country, it's very weird how our country classifies race. So you guys have heard about the census. Well, the census is how the country keeps track of how many people we have and what type of people are they. So it makes sense that there's a question about race on the census. But let's take a look at it. And while we're looking at it, think about how you would answer the question. Would you check one box or more? Would you even know which box to check? So number 8 asks, is person 1, basically the head of the household, Hispanic, Latino, or Spanish origin? And they put no, or they put yes with a specific. But then we go down to race. And when you look at the options, there's nothing about Latino or Hispanic or Spanish. So according to official US government documents, Latino is not really an actual race. A Latino person would identify either as white, black, or American Indian Native American based on their family's history. Now, you might not know your ancestors' history, and so what would you put? Would you guess? Would you put whatever you think was more advantageous to you? So technically, if you look at me and my girlfriend, I'm white and she's Latino, but according to the US government, we're just looking at a picture of two white people here. Now, when you ask yourself about race, and race is primarily based on looks. Does this make sense? And one final thing you gotta do is watch this Vox video below. If you're on Rad Class, it's literally right below this video. And I didn't want to add it to this video because I didn't want to steal their views on YouTube. So watch that, and then I'll see you back in class.